I don't know that I would have stuck with it if it wasn't for the continuous magic of people coming out of the woodwork to make it happen. A lot of times I become the face of it because I am the executive director and I am one of the founding members of it. But there's so many other founding members, there's so many other people who stepped in for 2 years, 3 years, and then had to step away. Without their energy, there would be no Boston Free Forest Coalition. And so the story really isn't about me. It's about grassroots energy, people really coming together to share with each other and believe in each other and believe in community. And to me, that's a very powerful message too.
Welcome, Orion. I first came across Orion when I was flicked this article called The Hope of the Global Citizens Movement. And I read through it and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'm going to reach out and see if I can find him. And I reached out on LinkedIn, and then I saw the Boston Food Forest Coalition. And I was like, oh, more interesting. And so it's such a pleasure to have you here today, Orion, and to hear your story. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm really glad you did reach out. It's been lovely to be connected, so thank you.
And I wanted to start kind of like actually I haven't asked this question before, but it came to me as we were coming in today. If you were to characterize your journey to this point, if you were to give it like it's a journey of ... what would it be?
Yeah. I think a core question that occurred to me at a young age is a question that I think increasingly is being asked in our culture. But when I was a young kid coming of age in the 1980s, I was very aware that some people have a lot and some people don't. And I just didn't understand why society was structured the way it was as a child. And I was curious, like, why do we put up with it? Why is it acceptable that we have this world the way it is? And what would it look like if we could start again at first principles and design society in a fair way? Like, I remember being fairly philosophical about it. And I think that led me on a series of questions about humans and the human animal and the nature of what we need in order to function together and hang together as community. And got very interested in political science and the theory of democracy, and just had the opportunity to keep exploring that question in post-Civil War, post-conflict situations. Like I spent some time in post-apartheid South Africa after the African National Congress came to power and was rewriting the new constitution. And as a very young person, I was able to play a very small role in some of that and just be exposed to these tremendous questions, and just keep that reflection alive in my heart. And I'd say another piece of it for me was just my family is very conflictual and very opinionated and very righteous. So I just grew up in that tumult, and out of need, I was curious, like, how do we create consensus? How do we do better conflict engagement and transform conflicts? Like, that was a primal need that I then took into looking at the world and then in the nature of conflict in the world. So peace building work, conflict transformation work has been a core theme for me. Peace and reconciliation with history. How do we do the repair that we need to do?
Oh, you've left so many threads open there. I'm going to just pull at one. Was there an incident that made you like personally aware of the inequity when you were young? Can you remember a person or an incident where you had that awareness of how inequity affected people?
I guess like some of the stories that come to mind for me are when I started more like high school into college volunteering, and saying, okay, I grew up in a bubble of privilege, relatively speaking. Some of the things that I think people would call privilege, I think, are just basic human rights, like the right for children to grow up in violence-free communities. but it is what it is. So I started to, as a young man, start to spend some time volunteering. And one of the early volunteer experiences I had was on a American Indian reservation in Montana, just helping out for a summer and just hearing their stories and understanding a little bit more about the legacy and the history of like how the reservation got created and sort of governed and the ways in which things rules and treaties weren't respected and what that's left the scars on the community, just the level of alcoholism and pain that was present. We were spending our that part of that summer was building an alcohol-free teen center so that there could be a space for teens to gather without alcohol. We're building baseball dugouts. We were doing like just basic tangible projects, and it was a well-designed program. It brought a lot of children from wealthier suburbs in America into a service activity to both learn and reflect and grow as individuals, but also to meet the community they were working in that summer. And then in college, I just continued in that vein. I would spend my spring breaks often going down to the communities in the South that had been hit by hurricanes, and we're either helping them rebuild or tear down the storm damage so that they could rebuild, and just getting involved in that and finding a lot of meaning and joy in that type of service, and just the tangible action of taking a sledgehammer to a wall and breaking it down so that we could create space for something new.
Well, I guess, I mean, first of all, I just want to say um, I appreciate this from a personal perspective, um, the South Africa connection. I spent a year there in college, and it was the 10-year anniversary of the end of apartheid. Um, and that was probably the first time that I saw the true global inequity, the global version of inequity. I mean, I had lived in a, to use your language, quite privileged area. And then I'd gone into the center of Los Angeles with my dad to work since I was a young child, and had seen sort of that spectrum. But being in South Africa, and then the relative the difference in the perspectives on racism in particular, and how kind of on the surface it was, really showed me a lot. So I appreciate. I'm just sharing that from a personal
Yeah,
place,
yeah.
having spent some time there, and that you helped to participate in that process. It definitely was
I
transformative
resonate
for me.
also with how I think this is partly what you implied, but that racism is socially constructed, and that means it's socially constructed differently in different countries,
Exactly.
histories.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so just something that, is so on if you're an American visiting South Africa, you're hopefully, definitely a college student is aware of the legacy of apartheid. And it shone such a light because it was so recently apparent, whereas we didn't grow up. I'm assuming, based on the story that you told, that neither of us grew up in a time where racism was entrenched in the laws themselves, explicitly. But that was a recent transformation in South Africa. So going there and seeing, just you're aware, I was aware of that racism so much on the surface, and so recently in the laws, that it definitely shown a light. But what I want to witness back is just a way of, as Miriam's leading the the interview, and I'm here as a witness primarily. The story of that you told of growing up in an environment where conflict exploration, conflict awareness, being in the tension of a conflictual environment taught you something that you're now using to then help to transform communities. And that gift and wound relationship, you didn't talk about it as a wound, but I imagine
oh
it had
yeah,
enough of an
yeah.
impact that there was wounding. And I just, to bring that out to the surface right from the beginning, and speak to the personal sort of orientation that you have and the investment that you have based on your own experiences, that also gave you a number of skills. I want to witness that back, elevate that, and the honesty. Some circles might call that the wounded healer, or the gift in the wound,
Mm.
um, aspect of doing potent work in the world. So I'm just going to witness that back and leave it there. I hope it's useful.
No, I appreciate that, and I resonate. Like it is it's both a strength and a weakness, right? I've heard someone, maybe it was Meg Wheatley, say um, a weakness is an overused strength. But there's a part of me which is comfortable with the notion that we do have conflict and that that's part of the world, and it's neither a positive thing nor a negative thing. It's how we engage it that transforms it either into something where we learn and grow in a positive way or fall apart in a negative way. So it's the engagement, but the reality of it is that it's part of life. And human beings, being social animals, if we're going to get something done, we got to learn how to engage. And that, people are the only game in town is something I often find myself saying. I'm not hearing you, Miriam.
We can't hear you, Mir.
Where did the impetus come from to volunteer? Like quite early on, you stepped into volunteering and action, and kind of sounded like it continued to be a fire within you. Where did that come from?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I often ask that question to myself now that I'm almost 50. Well, I'm going to turn actually 47 this year, so I'm rushing it a little bit. But why am I doing this work? I could have been, and actually was recruited out of college to go to Wall Street to an arbitrage firm and make a lot of money, and turned it down. So what's up with that? And I just can't imagine it being any other way, just given who I am and how it started. I think at a very, very young age, I was overwhelmed with an existential crisis about what is the meaning of this life we're living, and just not wanting to live a life rooted in fear and a need for safety and security, but saying I want to take risks and I want to experience and I want to understand, and this is my one lifetime to do that, and I'm going to try to be powerfully self-actualized in this life. That was a core value for me. Exactly what that meant at a young age, I didn't really know. And I just remember long walks with my dog and at night, reflecting on what do I need to have a meaningful life? I think romantic love, meaningful work, connection to family and friends. Do I need more than that? Just all that stuff was alive for me at a very young age. Partly it's a Jewish background. My father's Jewish and had a long, sort of series of conversations about his values and how to express them in the world with us as kids growing up. And, that was a theme that would just come up again and again in conversations. And I have a cousin who became a college professor who was at that time a radical environmental activist and was really excited about, I don't know, sort of the more radical edge of the environmental movement. And he and my dad would be arguing. They're older than me, and I would be sitting in the backseat of the car listening to their arguments. So I'm sure that influenced, my thinking and trying to make sense of what they were shouting about. And I think just I don't know what it is, but just a deep sense of care for people and nature was there at a very young age as well. Just really caring about animals, really caring about the natural world, really wondering why the world I was born into was shaped the way it was and how disrespectful and cruel it could be. And then really feeling it when people were suffering and just looking people in the eye a lot and just not being able to look away, I guess. And then maybe part of that is also looking into things like the Holocaust. I remember reading about that in junior high school, sixth, seventh grade, just coming across that and wondering how could a whole society become so genocidal? And then slowly growing up to the awareness that that genocide has taken place and that America has participated in that. And I spent 2 years living in Guatemala after their civil war, where there was significant genocide against the indigenous peoples of Guatemala. And so I think that more than anything opened my eyes in a more radical way to what does it mean to be outside the borders of empire and the privileges of having been born inside the empire and just the suffering that people routinely have to deal with. Like there's some statistic I remember, I don't know what the actual number is anymore, but I remember reading at one point 3 billion people don't have regular and consistent adequate access to clean water. That's, at the time I was like, that's half of humanity. That's half of humanity crying out. I mean, it's just not possible to like turn away from that in my mind.
So how do you move from that? There was a little bit of a theme earlier on that you were talking about with, the philosophizing and ideals of what should be, and then the kind of the pain and suffering of what was. How do you kind of move from philosophizing and thinking about it into the sort of action and work? How do you hold those two things between, what's mine to do, action and work, and the philosophizing, knowing that now you're fully in the work of it? What's the relationship between those two for you?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one because I think I have certain natural gifts that would have lent um, themselves to being in the academic world, and I was definitely nurtured by my college professors in that direction, and chose to step away from it precisely because I wanted to be less theoretical, less writing books and papers that very few people read or just sat on a shelf somewhere. And I wanted to see some impact in the world. And I think like maybe 40% of who I am, my personality is like this intellectual guy, and another 60% is just like more craftsy and wants to make things and get my hands on the dirt and bring people together and convene events and projects. Like, so I just want to make things go. So finding the right balance has been hard. It's been actually a struggle in my life to say, what's the path that I'm walking? And as a result, I don't really have a traditional resume and a traditional career path. I've been sort of making it up as I go along, and have been supported and nurtured to do so, and privileged to do so. I'm not sure what your question was. I lost track.
You answered it. It was the tension between those two things, and I think you're having started my cognition of you through the article that you wrote, which was quite academic, and was based on a story of hope. This is what I hope we can do together, to jumping into the work that you're doing now. What was that jump? How did you discover, the Boston Food Forest Coalition, and how did that,
Yeah,
what
yeah,
happened?
yeah. I think so just following the thread of political science and democracy, and spending some time in South Africa. I also spent some time during my college years in Israel, Palestine, just trying to talk to people about the possibility of peace there, and did what they called a peace studies mission that they sent college students to sort of interview players on both sides of that conflict. Then I moved to Guatemala, spent some time post-Civil War there. And then I got involved in a project that was looking at these big questions of how do we do peace building work? How do we bring and stitch the fabric of civil society together after it's been rent asunder through violence and intimidation and authoritarian dynamics. And I got really sort of frustrated with some of that, again, that trying to draw lessons learned from these really big challenges and sort of looking at these puzzles. And I thought I need to go back to graduate school. So I went back to graduate school. While I was there, I ended up focusing more and more on urban planning and the questions of like, whose city is it? How do decisions get made about the urban environment really have always been present in my mind, because you walk out your front door and you're like, I didn't choose this. Who chose this? And what role do I have in shaping this? And just I really felt that in Guatemala City more than anywhere else. Just like, when the dump catches fire and the air is polluted from that fire, and it doesn't matter if you're in a rich neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, you all breathe that same polluted air. So I was like, what is this wealth that shits on itself that it won't invest in basic infrastructure in its own community? Because Guatemala is the wealthiest country in Central America, but it's not necessarily like Costa Rica. It has a different dynamic. So I was like trying to figure that out. So I did go into sort of an urban planning, urban studies direction. And then I when I came back to looking for work after graduate school, I went right back into international questions of sustainable development and how we're going to deal with climate change. And I joined the Telus Institute, where I wrote this paper um, called "The Hope of the Global Citizens Movement: Dawn of the Cosmopolitan." And in that context, in some ways, it's almost like it was so intellectually rigorous. Like the Telus Institute was easily 10,000 feet in the air, but in a very rigorous way, trying to sort of like look at this complex challenge. How do we chart a path from the world we're in today to a world that's rooted in sustainability and equity? And it was engaging, and it was my job to engage scholars and activists on these key themes. And so I got very, very activated up here in the head and frustrated that it was like all up here in the head. And I wanted to get my hands down into the dirt. So I made a very conscious decision to leave the Telus Institute and leave that role, and sort of, in retrospect, maybe not the best career decision, because it was a network that I had invested in and built relationships with. And I basically walked away and got involved in a very local project, which over time emerged to become a community land trust that could own land and redevelop vacant lots in the city as the new commons, as edible food forests, parks that could also host cultural events and bring neighbors together in a very tangible way. And I think what led me to that was the neighborhood I was living in at the time in Boston, Eggleston Square, which is a neighborhood in transition still. It had been a very violent neighborhood when I moved there. There was active drug dealing. I could literally look outside my window and see drug deals going down. There was a flop house across the street where you could see prostitutes coming and going day and night. There was used needles that wound up in our yard. And there was gunshots routinely throughout the warmer months. It was a very, and that was a lot less violence than had been there historically. And one of the things that we did was, there was a vacant lot around the corner from our house, and we started asking the neighbors, what's the story behind this lot? And it was a trash lot. It had tires and TVs and car parts and more hypodermic needles and nip bottles. It was just a trash lot. And we said, well, what would you like to see happen here? And to a neighbor, everyone said, anything's better than what's going on currently. So we just decided to go and clean it up. I mean, it was a very simple gesture of taking responsibility for what we could control, right? And we just decided that we were going to convene a work day, and we were going to pick up the trash, and we were going to plant flowers to beautify it. And we notified the city of Boston. We said, we're going to go do this. We know that it's owned by the city. It was repossessed by the city when a house burned down. We did some research. And the city of Boston said, don't do it, don't do it. You don't have insurance. You're not authorized to do it. And we said, great, we'll be there on Saturday. Come tell us in person not to do it. So it was fun. It was collaborative. It was cross-cultural, cross-language, cross-class, cross-race, and so alive. And we did that for a number of months. And then in October, a young man was shot and killed right in front of this community space that we were creating. And that was horrifying and scary. And we came out for our workday to continue planting and cleaning it. And his friends and relatives were there holding a candlelight vigil. And at first there was an instinct of like, let's let them do their thing, their mourning. We're here to clean up. We'll just sort of like keep our distance and respect each other. But people involved in my group were like, nah, these people are hurting. Let's bring them soup. Let's bring them water. Let's invite them to plant a blueberry bush and share some words in memory. Let's hang a banner on the chain link fence and have them write rest in peace. And other folks were watching from their windows, and they saw this, dynamic happening of what felt like real healing and connection and mourning and grief. And it had ripple effects throughout the whole neighborhood. I could go on and on. It was actually a very complicated story. But the core takeaway for me was like, oh, this is so much more than building one little garden. This is where it's at. This is what it means to create community in a diverse urban environment. And the fact that it had so many ripple effects throughout the whole neighborhood made me think, wow, we just need more of this. And I think that's what really brought me into doing the Boston Food Forest Coalition.
Wow.
I love, can I jump in here real quick?
Yeah, please.
Miriam? I love that it sounded like you tried to think your way into getting your hands into the ground, both metaphorically and literally. And then if I was going to tell this story in sort of an anecdote, you looked next door and found yourself working on something, and it all grew from there. So you came from that theory. Like I heard that tension really in Miriam, the question that Miriam asked you, how did you move from sort of theory into the doing, or academia into action? And there's like almost this false I don't know, expectation that somehow it was going to be easy. And I say false because I think so many people have this idea. Like if I know I do, like I'm just going to find the one thing that encapsulates everything that I am and want to be and have been, and then get it. And there's going to be an easy title for that. And somehow it will be simple. And if it's not, it's a tension that I've been navigating my whole life. But then the truth of your work, from what the story you just told, was like, no, we just looked at the lot next door and everything happened from there. It's like there's a poetry in that story that I really appreciate. And I am sure it's much more complex than you said. There, it was more complicated, but
no, I love how you're reflecting that back. I really do appreciate that. Because again, it's resonant. It's like there's a starting point, right? It's like you pull on any one thread though, and you realize it's woven into the whole tapestry.
Yeah.
And that's also been part of why the Boston Food Forest Coalition has captured my attention and interest for so long. It's like, it's this one little spot. Let's say we're transforming a 5,000 square foot vacant lot in the city. And yet it's holistically intertwined with so many of these diverse systemic issues that we're trying to address, right? So it's, and I think there is also just this tension, like if you're really intellectually rigorous, it's like between theory and empiricism, right? So it's like there's all these theories about how social change happens, and then there's like, oh, let's go out there and try it and see what the world tells us is going to work or not, right? So in some ways, I just chose the empirical path.
Yeah. And so how does this story, I'm going to steal Miriam's question. Where does it go from there, from that one lot? What happened next? How did this become an organization?
Yeah, at that time, I had a job that required that I do community organizing around the framework of a new economy. Like, how do we generate initiatives at a local level that tap into this, try to transform the whole institutions of our economic system so that they're more cooperative, like looking at models of commoning and collective ownership, worker-owned cooperatives, community land trusts. Like we were thinking about all these things that prior generations of activists and communities struggling for survival had created out of necessity, but could we root a whole new economy in these institutions rather than the institutions we have currently? And could we generate that locally and make that relevant to people in a diverse urban neighborhood like the one we were living in Boston at the time? So I was doing that work anyway. I was being paid to be a community organizer and was convening, the State of Our Neighborhood Forum, where we brought together community leadership and activists with elected officials, and we had a real conversation. What's the state of our neighborhood, and how do we, prepare for climate change and the rising costs of food and fuel? Like we saw all of the writing on the wall about what we're dealing with right now, but we saw it, 10 years or more ago. And we just wanted to say, how do we start taking action today in anticipation of what we can see coming down the road? And one of the things that came up was two veterans from the military, one from the Coast Guard and one from Afghanistan, had been shopping around this idea of a food forest in Boston. And they had been inspired by the one in Seattle on Beacon Hill in Seattle. And so they had been talking to all these community-based organizations and nonprofits in Boston to get endorsements. And they showed up at one of our big community events and they announced that, like we often had people stand up and announce what project they were working on. And so they announced their food forest project and said that they had run out of energy for it and they wanted to hand it off, and that they had this list of endorsements and they had the concept, but that's as far as they had taken it. And I just watched as an organizer how many people flocked to their corner of the room to find out more versus any of the other projects that were happening that day. And as an organizer, you're trying to understand the path of least resistance to engage with people where they're at. And clearly, food-related projects, bringing open space, parks, and nature into the city, like there was so much energy, just organically present. And so I continued to play my role for a little while of just nurturing that energy, helping them convene meetings, not leading those meetings, but really being in the background as a facilitator and convener so that they could shape it for themselves. So they came up with the name Boston Food Forest Coalition. Other neighbors stepped in to lead that initiative and reached out to Mass Audubon's Boston Nature Center to form a partnership with the only urban wildlife sanctuary that Massachusetts Audubon has. And for a while, it was just this joyful energy of neighbors from Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, Roslindale, Mattapan, Dorchester coming together and having done different projects. And I was actively involved, as I mentioned, with a project in Eggleston Square. That was also, it was a personal project of my volunteer time, but it connected into this whole big question that was swirling around how do we defend these spaces that neighbors have come together to create when there's so much gentrification and development going, and developers routinely swoop in and gobble up parcels that they want without any community input. So we were just thinking about that. And being the behind the scenes person, it was my job to do the unglamorous work. So I was talking to other nonprofits and other organizations. Could you see taking on these initiatives and supporting them and nurturing them and the land that comes with them? And everyone was too busy with their own projects. So that's when we basically came to the notion that we would need to incorporate an independent community land trust to own the land if we wanted to ensure that it wasn't going to be gobbled up by future development. And around that point, some of the key earlier volunteer leaders had to step away. One woman, Allison Meyerding, was having her first child, and she was really like the unpaid executive director in the early days of the Boston Food Forest Coalition. And nobody else could afford to quit their job and step into an unpaid position and take it that next step. But it had been going for about a year and a half at that point, and I was just like, I don't want to see this energy fizzle. So I left my role as sort of community organizer on the new economy transition and just stepped into how do we get this community land trust built. And I had the skill set and the knowledge about like what it takes to incorporate a nonprofit and pull together, the pro bono legal support and the board and all the different pieces that go into that. And one thing led to another, and here I am 7 years later, continuing to work on it. Because when you first start a project, I don't think you ever really know what you're getting into and just how many details it takes. But like the idea of a community land trust or collective ownership of land, like that really appeals to me from a political science intellectual point of view. So here is a chance to make it real in the city. And it's been growing. I don't know that I would have stuck with it if it wasn't for the continuous magic of people coming out of the woodwork to make it happen. A lot of times I become the face of it because I am the executive director and I am one of the founding members of it. But there's so many other founding members. There's so many other people who stepped in for 2 years, 3 years, and then had to step away or moved out of town. Without their energy, there would be no Boston Food Forest Coalition. And so the story really isn't about me. It's about grassroots energy. I might have played a catalyzing role, but it wouldn't have been possible if that latent desire wasn't present. And people really coming together to share with each other and believe in each other and believe in community. And to me, that's a very powerful message too.
I'm so struck, I think, both in the attraction of the outcome. So like the initial, when you initially said, people were attracted to that corner, the idea of locally grown food that they could access in the urban environment. And then also in your story, just when your face lights up, it's around the community experience of doing something together. And I can only imagine in all of this that the complexity that you drew out in your academic intellectual work, that same complexity of dealing with systems and, like, oh, come down on Saturday and see us and tell us to our faces, kind of like, like dealing with the structures and having, I'm really interested, having done all of that work in convening conversations and looking at different structures, how that played out with this kind of project. Now it's 7 years later, where you've, in a very specific context, in a specific outcome of a project, had, where does that information come in from those conversations? How does that play a part, in terms of what you learned through the more kind of intellectual conversational phase of your career? How do those two things interplay?
Well, I do think there's like a real painful history in Boston, and Boston has a reputation that's probably well earned of being a racist town. And some of that pain that happened in the 70s with the busing crisis, where kids from Black communities were being bused to schools in white communities, and you'd have these white neighbors lining the streets throwing rocks at these buses as they drove by and shouting insults. Like, those kids from the 70s are still alive and still part of the community here. It's not like that history went anywhere, right? It's all still here with us. So if we're going to create something that's a truly multiracial coalition across Boston neighborhoods, it has to address that history, and it ideally is a source of healing, as we build this. So that appeals to me intellectually. I think there's a big thread there all the way back to thinking about conflicts and how do you build peace in conflictual societies. Well, here we are living not necessarily in an active hot conflict like an active war zone, but it's still a conflictual society with a lot of pain, injury, and trauma. And how do we move forward? And how do we face our history? And what does it mean about how we have to reinvent our own sense of identity in order to do that work? So I really do believe that these big core conflicts require us to be open to transforming our sense of who we are if we're really going to heal. And then inviting neighbors into that process of healing and growth, and recognizing that you have to meet people where they're at. So some people are further down that road on a personal self-development level than other people, and yet we're all in community together here, right? So it's like, how to do that and do that well is fascinating, challenging, exhausting, but utterly meaningful and essential, and really has lessons that will apply anywhere else in the world. It's not specific to Boston necessarily. So being part of that movement of healing the world and being part of healing it in my corner of the world feels very meaningful, and thinking about how movements build and how culture shifts, I think is a very abstract question, but then also realizing that, like, it's an iterative process. Like, people need a place to come together to express their values and express their sense of emerging identity, and that we are facilitating that. We are a vehicle for that. And that as life becomes more challenging due to climate change and just the general global emergency, I mean, there's so many facets to it. Climate change is just one of the headline facets, but like, in some ways, climate change is more a symptom than a cause of things. So as life gets to be more challenging, there's going to be the upshot of that is there's going to be more and more people looking for ways to come together. There is this sort of aspect of the human animal that wants to play nice and cooperate and feel part of a community and have a sense of belonging. And when we need to lean on each other, we create that very quickly. And so we're going to have already been here laying the groundwork for that, and we can catch some of that energy, and we can hopefully help direct it in good directions. So for me, that ties a lot into that essay that you discovered, the hope of the global citizens movement. I don't know. I mean, aside from me personally having been someone who worked globally and now is working locally, I'm not sure how you make the global local connection more real. But I do feel like that's a big question for the evolution of humanity. Like, do we only care about each other in a parochial way, or do we care about each other in a global way? And I think there's reason to be hopeful that we can learn to care about each other on a global level. But yeah, I don't know the answer to it.
I'm wondering, you said something that I wanted to dive into a little bit, which is about well, you're talking about systems change, but then identity change, like reconceiving or a reemergence of who we think we are or how we conceive of ourselves. And I'm wondering, like, I couldn't just leave it there. What is that? What do you think that means? Because that's, to me, that's all the technical solutions in the world and all the theories and all they're if our identity, if our identity can make all of them sort of it can become impenetrable to those ideas actually grabbing hold of
Yeah,
us. So
like if in America it's important to have cheap hamburgers, right? And that's core to like the American way of life.
yeah,
Like, can we ever give them up?
yeah, in spite of all the data and all the perfect
Right.
solutions, right? So so what do you think that looks like? How would you label the emerging identity if I forced you to label that right now, or the one that will get us through these times, and how do you think
Well,
that process happens?
I think there is like a tendency to go towards like the quick fix, the consumer based solution. You know, Al Gore's movie, like at the end, he's like, we all have to change our light bulbs, which is a wonderful thing to do, but isn't going to necessarily get us where we're trying to get to, right? So it's like there is sort of a tendency to sort of believe like, oh, we're just going to keep driving cars exactly as we've always done, only they'll be fueled by renewables, rather than to say, whoa, there's something about change to the core. Maybe COVID inspired us to take a step back and say, whoa, there is something about change to the core that needs to be um, engaged with here, because we're not going to get to a planet of billions of people thriving and living to their fullest potential if we pretend to ourselves that we can just keep going on business as usual with a few upgrades in technology. It doesn't add up. And I think that's partly why politically it's so fraught, because most people who look at the issue in a rigorous way will see that it doesn't add up. And so what we're talking about is a choice between some pretty radical transformation, or on the one hand, or careening off a cliff on the other. And either way, it's like a rock in a hard place, because radical transformation is not easy. And to make that worthwhile, we're going to have to feel the pressure of it. Like, I just don't see that we get there without confrontation and conflict and pressure. And then the question is, like, there's going to be competing forces that emerge. We already see it happening. There's reactionary forces. Like when life gets tough, there's pro-social, imaginative, creative energy that emerges, and there's reactionary, shut down, um, keep close what you have and don't let anyone else take it from you sort of energy. And both things are very much rooted in our nature and in our psychology, I would argue.
Do you feel both of those too? Like
Yeah,
I find myself going back and forth between those two parts, as if, again, like as if there shouldn't be a tension between them, like, or I don't want to admit that usually.
yeah,
There's a part that wants to protect and sort of defend and ensure my own personal security, and there's this other part that wants to participate in, like, building the thing that's going to help us fly when we inevitably careen off that cliff.
yeah. Yeah, I think one of the harder parts about the work I've been doing for 7 years is confronting my own naivete in some ways about, like, I really believe in community. I really believe in the good of humans. And some people are really selfish and can't step out of that. And there's a lot of problematic characters. When you say, oh, we're going to work with everybody in the neighborhood, well, watch out. You better have some way of filtering people. So like, and that's made me realize, like, oh, okay, I understand why we've created the rules and the structures in the ways that we have to um, protect ourselves from cheaters, I guess, for lack of a better word. The people who are going to try to like fake one way and grab for themselves. Like, and then I think we all have that in us, right? So it's like, how do we keep reminding ourselves to believe in our better angels, right? And to like aim towards our higher selves, even if we're not there every day, because we all have hard lives. Life on Earth is unrelentingly hard. I mean, I think it's true for anybody at any part of the social system that we're in. And for some people, harder than others, but definitely it's hard for everybody. And so what do we do with that? How do we create ways of coping and creating space for expression of our grief and our pain as we continue to try to create opportunities for hope and joy and for our children and grandchildren to thrive? I mean, I think that's like the core dilemma of our generation and future generations from now on.
I was, yes, yes, yes. To both of you, yes. Welcome to my daily thoughts. I was also like really struck with the idea of radical transformation, the feeling of like that peek into, oh wow, we have to radically transform in order to meet the challenges. And then the way you described the very incremental local, what's around me, kind of what can I do, and it's a bit like the global local thing, but the kind of relationship between the two. And I guess what I'm really interested in your work over the last 7 years, what have you seen that's been radical? Like, we often think about radical change as, like, well, I do at least, of like radical transformation of like, okay, no one's driving cars anymore, or we're flying in different ways, or do you know what I mean? But I'm very interested if you've seen that not those examples, but if you've seen or experienced radical transformations in the kind of local, in hands in the dirt work that you're doing, and what they look like.
Yeah, I like to think that community land trusts are a radical invention. It has a long history. It started off as a vehicle in the civil rights movement to help Black farmers gain access to land. Then it was taken over by folks like Bernie Sanders when he was mayor of Burlington, and other activists to say, how do we build permanently affordable housing in communities, urban communities? And it continues. I mean, and in Boston, there's the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network that is advocating for more and more local government support for community land trusts and sort of an agenda around collective land ownership. So collective ownership, the commons, is a radical concept increasingly in our society. It's like the Boston Commons was created a long time ago, but people had an ethic for it. I think that ethic is still existing, but it's like a weak muscle. Like our democracy muscle, needs to be exercised again. So finding ways to exercise that democracy muscle. Worker-owned cooperatives, I've seen them come and go, but there's examples throughout the world, in Japan and Italy and in the Basque region of Spain, where they really thrive and they really show that they can outcompete standard capitalist firms. And so their potential, I think, is very real. I know there's a lot of challenges with them as well. So those, like collective community ownership of renewable energy, decentralized energy production, I would say would be something else that seems radical. And there's examples of that has shown up over the years. Creation of local currencies,
Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing that I was part of doing a little pilot experiment. We helped create a farmer's market, and then we helped launch a local currency for a year. And it was immediately exciting, more in an imaginative way. But one can imagine moments where it's actually a necessity, like where you have real breakdown of national currencies. And actually, we've seen that, like in the 1980s in Britain, there's a lot of local currencies cropped up. In Argentina, when they had a currency collapse, a lot of local currencies cropped up. In the US in the 1930s, a lot of local currencies cropped up, and people just keep reinventing it. It wasn't like they all studied each other. It was more like out of necessity, people figured it out again and again and again. And I think that is a sign that like there's this, necessity is the mother of invention, but there's the capacity of humans to make these real creative leaps when we have to, when our back's against the wall.
So, and you've repeated that a couple of times, so I want to come back to that like it's going to take us to have our backs against the wall to really make change. But I just want to ask a specific question about what have been, in your experience of the collective ownership of the land trusts, what are the key challenges in collective ownership that you've experienced in that?
The key challenge is that people don't really want to negotiate through their conflicts. I mean, it's scary. We don't have good role models. It's not like we grew up in tribal societies where our elders taught us how to, sit in council and achieve consensus. So there's that aspect of like, oh my God, I'm going to have to own this piece of land with all these other people, and especially if you add in race and class differences and the mistrust that's there for legitimate reasons, because history's been really hard and painful. Yeah, it's just like inviting people into that work and saying, well, this is the work that we need to learn how to do again. We need to reinvigorate this, as I said, that the democracy muscle, so that the next generation has an easier path, and hopefully the generation after that even easier. And that there really isn't a shortcut. There really isn't no like silver bullet, right? It is hard work, and we have to build trust. And community moves at the speed of trust. And so step into collective ownership with this multiracial coalition. It's for some people, it's the adventure they've been waiting for, and they're ready to go. And for other people, it's like, whoa, what are you asking me to get involved in?
Adam, I'll leave space for you. No, you're good. And yeah, I think I was imagining all the conflicts. How do you like within that hard work, how do you keep people involved? Like you had this fire of like, okay, this is my work in the world, but especially people who perhaps have, to be really focused on their own survival or through need or just through want, aka the
Yeah.
selfish. Like, what is the way that you like? What is the thing that keeps people wanting to be involved?
Yeah, I think leadership really matters. And when I say leadership, I don't necessarily mean leaders. Like I make a distinction, I guess, between sort of people put in positions of authority and power versus leadership, which is something that anyone can exercise. But there is also a quality of some people are more naturally inclined or gifted or skilled in the complexity of multi-stakeholder projects. And without them, projects just don't go. And um, you can't always find them. So sometimes projects don't go. But when projects do go and go well, it's because there are certain individuals who are able to shoulder some of that burden of leadership and put that on their shoulders. And I don't think that humans are self-organizing. I think we have to acknowledge the hard work it takes to organize people and lift up those leaders and recognize the sacrifices that they're making on behalf of the broader community so they don't feel alone. And in doing so and making it transparent, we also can keep them accountable to their values and the goals that they say they're working towards. So it's better to acknowledge the necessary leadership and support it than to try to submerge it or pretend that it's not there, I think. And then I think people have genuinely heart-opening, transformative experiences building these food forests. Like I know I did with the Eggleston Community Orchard. I mentioned the young man who was shot and killed, and how that transformed the neighborhood and how that opened me up personally. I then did a project with neighbors on Ellington Street in Dorchester who, when I first got involved, a lot of those neighbors were scared of each other, and there was not a strong social fabric on that particular street. And it was through the building of that food forest that neighbors met across diversity. There's some neighbors who had been there for 40 years. There's some folks who were in transitional housing on that street. There's some folks who had just moved there from the Caribbean or from Central Africa. I mean, there's a lot of different cultures and peoples there. And it was in sharing food and creating a garden and imagining it and coming together and laughing and crying through the process of building it that some healing and community fabric has stitched together. And we just recently had after COVID, we've been coming back together in person and doing collective events, which is a big part, I think, of why this work succeeds at all. So with COVID, that was a major challenge. But like coming back, there's been this annual Food as Medicine event at the Ellington Community Food Forest. And it's just a beautiful day. It's beautiful people. It's like lovely nature. There's such pride for the space. If you go to the space, it's not a traditional formal garden, so you might say it looks a little messy or wild or unkempt, but that's also intentional, and the neighbors are really proud of it. Everything needs some TLC. The garden beds are no longer brand new, like they were in the grand opening. The shed could use some repair, but so it's like there's always some room for improvement and work to be done, but there's so much pride and care in that space. And some of the neighbors who are leading that, the women who are the leaders of the stewardship team, they wrote me a very nice card, that just affirmed that, like, the work we're doing really does matter and impacts people in their lives. And that brought tears to my eyes, because it's like, yeah, that's it. That's the fact that you can feel the purpose of it, that these are like tangible seeds of hope. Because they say the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, and the second best time is today. So these are like, we're putting trees in the ground for the future. And that tangibility of that hope is so important, I think. Yeah, so I think that is not just something that I experience, but something that anyone who spends time in a project gets to experience. Again, like I could tell that story about the Uplands Corner Food Forest, the Savins Hill Food Forest, the Edgewater Food Forest, just neighbors coming together and feeling that joy of coming together and achieving something together, and then taking pride in what they did, and the expression, the tangible expression of that, and then how that ripples out and how other people are inspired by that. That, I think, is what feeds us. The food too, definitely. And gardening's a fun hobby for folks, not for everyone, but for a lot of folks. So the food, the flowers, the songbirds, all that is part of what feeds us. But definitely that sense of accomplishment and pride that we get from coming together.
A visceral way of experiencing a shared aim and moving through things that has a kind of tangible outcome.
And then you see it does have ripple effects. It inspires, it pulls people into leadership in ways that they never had been before. It takes people who were in leadership and inspires them to sort of step up their game and join some other climate leadership initiative that the city's offering. We've seen people sort of go on from here. Like the Eggleston Community Orchard, the core neighbors who brought that into existence, 3 of them were Boston public school teachers that decided to become full-time farmers. And so it's sort of bittersweet because they've moved away to get farmland, but also really beautiful to see how it's changed their lives and brought them into the joy of that work.
Yeah. And I just kind of I feel like there's so much. I can feel palpably the joy of the and when you said a community that's thriving, being able to kind of like the tangibility of actually working together to create thriving plants and trees and food that we can eat and that can nourish us. And I also don't want to undercut. It must have taken a hell of a lot of work to establish, the land trust itself, and to establish a successful infrastructure that could make that happen and continue to support that happening. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, and just anything around that hard work of the organization that is kind of like you mentioned, invisible. Like there's the outcome, visible and tangible, and here's this hard work of actually making it happen in the background with the kind of the boring work of the laws and the conflicts that come up.
Yeah, I want to like capture what you just said and share that with my staff, because it is a lot of work, and I think sometimes not fun, sometimes draining and exhausting and painful. Hopefully more often more fun. Hopefully as it goes forward, more graceful, and we find more partnerships and community relationships that bring joy and add to our lives over time. But there have definitely been some dead ends that we've had to go down in order to, I think one of the tricks is just perseverance. And like, I'll give a quick example. This is sort of maybe a minor micro example in microcosm, but it has the flavor of what I mean. Is the folks who created the Savin Hill Food Forest, they initially didn't know how to come together as a community group, and they were skeptical of it. And then there's a lot of joy in building it and planting it and designing it and having their voice, be an input into the process and seeing that manifested, which is a rare experience in the city. And then they were out there planting some beautiful perennial flowers, and the next day somebody had stolen them all. And then the next day some more flowers were stolen. And so this year we were dealing with the demoralizing impact of vandalism and thievery, which is just a reality of a big city, I think. There are plant thieves, and that's just, what are you going to do? It's probably a very small minority of people who are causing vandalism on our sites, but they have an outsized impact on the morale of the stewardship team, which is all volunteer, and pouring their heart and soul into this space and taking such pride in what's growing, and then only to see it no longer there or destroyed or stolen is a real blow. But then that's where we step in as a staff team with sort of our, in nonprofit speak, our high touch technical assistance. But what does that mean? It means we have relationships with people, and we listen, and we help people vent their anger and their frustration, and we help persevere, and we turn towards positive solutions, and people overcome. And I think that experience is one that we don't often give ourselves in this culture of instant gratification, of pushing through hardship and overcoming and getting to the other side of it and learning that you can get there. That's a lesson in resilience that now the entire community around the Savin Hill Food Forest has. And hopefully that continues to carry them through whatever other challenges show up.
What carries your staff?
We have such committed people, and good people, like, who take care of each other, and like what we did before this chat, where you check in on a human level and you really hear about people's lives. And we got each other's backs. And I think we're still learning each other. We just hired new staff this year, and we're going to be hiring new staff next year if all goes according to plan. We're on a growth trajectory. We still need individual donors, especially Bostonians, to step up and make multi-year commitment to being in partnership with us on a funding level, because that's going to allow us to hire staff and pay them good wages and benefits, which is essential if we're going to have a diverse team, because not everyone can have the privilege of being underpaid in the nonprofit sector. So what carries the staff, I think, is just like, we definitely in the hiring process, like, we found people who, like, this is their core value. Like, we hired people who were going to chain themselves to trees to make sure those trees weren't cut down, who've been fighting for decades for affordable housing and resources for their communities that have been underserved and neglected, and who just get the meaning of this work. I mean, I think that is, I don't know what that is. I mean, you asked me that question too about myself. Like, where do we come from? Why do we throw ourselves into this? Why not choose something else to do with our time on Earth? I don't really know the answer to that question. Like, I think it's a bit of a mystery. Like, maybe we're just deranged in a social way.
Adam, any comments on that derangement? I'm purposely handing to you.
I was just imagining, you said you found people that chain themselves to trees and things like that. And I was just imagining the minimum qualifications on your job description. I'm pretty sure that you didn't find people necessarily through public. Maybe you're not finding all those folks, those committed staff, through public job openings. But I just imagine the minimum qualifications and a slight level of, a certain measure of derangement required as a minimum qualification. So that was what I was thinking when I was hearing you describe your staff in the best way. And that was, by the way, my, looking at all the other job applications and things that pop up now and then, and the sort of emptiness of the qualifications in comparison to the type of folks that you're bringing on and that are doing this type of work, how you even find those people.
A lot of young people are looking for a way to put their values into action. And that when we do have job postings to join the Boston Food Forest Coalition, we get more applicants, some incredibly talented people that we have to turn away. It would be nice to be able to hire everybody, but we just can't. But it's indicative to me that there's a hunger for these opportunities to be part of the healing work in the world today.
I can't believe that I'm leaving this question to the last 5 minutes of the podcast, and I hope it's like not like throwing something at the like, and then we go, too hard, let's go. Money. Money. It's like, both Adam and I have been co-executive directors of a not-for-profit, and the relationship between donors and projects and money and so much of the work that we do with not-for-profits, it's like when the rubber hits the road, when it comes to money, that's where the tunnel vision kind of comes in, and it's like, so what is your experience of that, the money side of things, and how does that change what you do or not?
Money is important. I mean, we need to be able to pay, as I was saying, if we want to have a diverse team, we need to be able to pay competitive salaries so that people of different backgrounds have the opportunity to work with us. We can't assume that everyone has the privilege to be underpaid. And I mean that sincerely. I had that privilege. I could step into a role that was unpaid for a year or so, partly because at the time I was married and my ex-wife at that time was willing to support me to take a risk on a project that was untested. But not everyone has that privilege. So I think the challenge is how to diversify your sources of money and how to stay true to your mission. I think this is an opportunity, the Boston Food Forest Coalition is an opportunity for anyone who's excited to get involved in partnership with community grassroots leaders who are directly at the intersection of racial justice and climate resilience. Like if that is your jam, this is the opportunity you've been waiting for, because we're here doing it. And we've had donors who've also gotten very involved as volunteers. So that would be one way to sort of try to square the circle in terms of authenticity and having real relationships with folks. We've got people who are only donors and are far away, and they get to take pride in the fact that they're supporting something and they don't put a lot of strings attached, which really lets the community continue to lead it. And I think that's important as well. And we've been really blessed to find those types of relationships. We have relationships with the city of Boston where they kick in money. Different parts of the city are different, so it's not all one monolithic creature. The city of Boston is a multi-headed creature. Sometimes one head doesn't know what the other head's doing. But we have built relationships with the Mayor's Office of Housing, which has been incredibly generous and incredibly supportive, both in terms of providing land and resources to develop that land. So they like their money to primarily go towards hard costs, but that's important. Who pays for the trees and the benches and the ADA accessible pathways and the garden sheds and all that stuff. That's critical, and that actually helps us with the momentum. So as you get community buy-in, people like to see a train leaving the station. So if we didn't have that initial infusion for capital costs, that would make potentially things unravel. So it's great the city is meeting that bottom-up grassroots energy with top-down resources. I mean, that's a rare moment, I think, in city politics. And so that's a beautiful thing that Boston's able to do right now. And then there's foundations, and foundations, some are easier to work with than others, in my experience, just like some city departments are easy to work with than others. So part of it is finding, we can't do everything. We don't have currently a development office in our nonprofit. I think we absolutely need one. I mean, I think initially when I set off to do this work, I didn't believe in that, but as I've seen how the nonprofit sector operates, I understand the value of having certain people who are dedicated towards grant management. Like otherwise these grants are unwieldy. We got one grant where halfway through they changed the criteria of success, so it had nothing to do with what we told them we were going to do, and they asked us to administer a survey of all our participants, but they didn't acknowledge that there's any cost to that. They didn't give, and here's additional funding so that you can actually administer the survey successfully. So the survey felt like, to me, a waste of time because it wasn't going to be administered scientifically. So what sort of real data are you going to get from it? And so like all these like things that funders can do where they just throw additional work at you and additional demands on your time without thinking about the impact on your ability to deliver the impact you say you're going to deliver can be challenging. So finding foundations and funders who don't do that, who respect you and respect the choices you're making and want to be in partnership with you is crucial. And I think in some ways individuals are often the most flexible source of support. And, this is a legacy that we're building for future generations of Bostonians. So there's an opportunity for people who care about that and want to be part of creating a legacy for all of Boston to step up and step in with their resources. And some people really do have capacity to give, and that's amazing that they do, and quite generous when they do. I like to think of it as part of the process of redistributing resources. We talk about, at one point we were going out to Framingham to get horse manure from a family that happened to have a horse barn, and they had a pile of horse manure. It's very, very valuable for repairing broken, damaged soils. And so we jokingly talked about how we're redistributing the wealth from the suburbs back to the urban community. I think there's some truth to that. That's a joking example, but I think the overall point is there is some truth to that, and there's dynamics around that are problematic, and the whole nonprofit sector struggles with. Like, this is not about, it can devolve into parading people around to try to raise money, and that's something we're committed to absolutely not doing that, and to find a better way to be in right relationship with all our stakeholders, and to really try to stitch a coalition together. That's partly in our name, Boston Food Forest Coalition, and it takes everybody to make that coalition happen.
Adam, final call.
I will just say thank you for the work that you're doing, and also today, the transparency, both the joy that you're bringing and the transparency that you've brought to this conversation, have made me feel, even though what you're doing is so big and so complex and so courageous, I felt on the level with you the whole time, and I appreciate that in a conversation, and just with being on the planet with you at this time, knowing that you're out there doing the work. So thank you for that. I don't have any further questions.
Well, I think that I have this. Partly because when I read your article, I had a very visceral image. As I said, I'm reading the Ministry of the Future, so like very imagining. But I really did, of this future vision of the world. And if you were to step forward in time and to imagine the future vision of the world that the Boston Food Forest Coalition has built, what does it look like? What does it feel like? How is that fire caught lit?
I think partly my source of hope about the future is that the future is fundamentally unknowable. And I think that's a good thing. We live in a world, in a universe of emergence, and there's always the potential for emergent surprises. Could be negative, but also could be positive. So we really don't know what's going to happen. And the other thing is, I believe, and if you believe as I do, that humans are agents, that we have some agency in the world, we have some creative power in the world, we have choice-making ability, then the future is composed of choices we haven't made yet. And so to the extent that we have agency, we get to make these choices. So the future is not someplace we're going, but something that we're actively creating. And my hope is that we find a way to stitch together a racially just, sustainable local food system regionally in New England, maybe in the Northeast, involving New York and Quebec, and and that in doing that, we're paying people living wages, we're growing food sustainably and healthfully, restoring land and nature. We're inspiring each other by the sheer triumph of such a thing. And we're able to reach out with generosity and support to other regions and other parts of the world that are doing the same work. And we're able to act increasingly in a web of mutual aid, and that we rebuild the fabric of global community that way. I know that's kind of vague and also very ambitious at the same time. So I'm not trying to pretend like it's an easy path or even a likely outcome. I just think it's possible. And so to stand in the space of possibility, I think, is increasingly important, especially as the global emergency will deepen. It is deepening currently. It will get much harder before it gets easier, and it'll be very easy to give into despair. So we need to remind each other to stay in the space of possibility.
Well, thank you for the reminder and the possibility, and for putting your hands in the dirt, and also again, just want to acknowledge all of the hard work behind the scenes that it takes to do that, and to bring that possibility to people, and to encourage them also to just put their hands in the dirt with each other. So thank you so much for your story and for the time today.
Yeah, Miriam, Adam, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about my work and to honor it in the way that you've done, and to really hear and listen and be present. It's very inspiring. It's very beautiful to see the work you're doing in the world and lifting up these stories, and also just facilitating and inviting people to lead with vulnerability. I think we got to remember our humanity in all of this. So it is hard work, and I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.